Movement was the aim with which the tank visionaries began. They saw a battlefield on which movement was all but impossible. An armored machine seemed to promise the means of restoring mobility to the soldier. But could those pioneers have even glimpsed the astonishing speed and agility that their brainchild would attain?
Well, the third principle that underlies the concept of the tank, and is the principle that's done more than anything else to change the face of battle in the 20th century, is its mobility. I'm standing in the turret of Challenger, Britain's latest main battle tank, and we just came down a section of that track behind us at over 45 miles an hour. Despite its 62 tons of all-up weight, the Challenger will also go over the roughest terrain very fast indeed, either forwards or, if necessary, backwards. It's tanks like these and their predecessors that have given back to commanders that element of shock that they lost when cavalry disappeared from the battlefield.
The tank reintroduced movement into modern warfare after the stalemate of the First World War, even if the speeds of the early tanks pale into insignificance compared to the modern tank. On no battlefield of the First World War did the tank really make good its potential as an instrument of mobility. At first, it was used in numbers too small to count. Then it was misused, launched in the spring of 1917 into a battlefield that had been shelled into a bog. At Cambrai in the autumn of 1917, when tanks were used en masse for the first time, cooperation with the infantry broke down. The attack, brilliantly successful at the outset, finally failed. At Amiens in 1918, the greatest of the tank battles of the war, it was the tanks themselves which failed to live up to their promise. They proved too slow and too unreliable. They undoubtedly terrified the Germans, but they did not demonstrate that they were a decisive instrument of breakthrough. With the victory of the Allies, the traditional high command thought that trench warfare would not happen again, so the importance of the tank was downgraded. The Americans even abolished the tank corps after 1918. In France, the infantry and artillery fought for control of the tanks, and the infantry won. This meant tanks became the infantry's handmaiden. In the British Army, the tank corps, though well established by 1926, was resented, especially by the cavalry. The conservative military leaders of the day saw the tank's job as supporting the other arms in the various roles once carried out, as the battle developed, by the cavalry.
You had a sort of period of skirmishing as you approached the enemy, in which you had light forces, which in the very old days had been cavalry, who told you where the enemy were while you made up your mind whether or not you were actually going to accept battle and how you were going to accept it. And then you had a major battle in which the infantry took a classic part. And they saw tanks as being required for two things: to act as sort of light cavalry, in which case you wanted light tanks, and to act in support of the infantry in the main battle itself, and also to act, as cavalry was used in the Middle Ages and beyond, as a sort of shock action at a crucial part in the battle which had been created by the infantry fighting.
Yet it was two British military thinkers, Basil Liddell Hart and General Fuller, who proposed the idea of the tank revolution. They argued that the tank was the key to the military future, and that far from being anyone's handmaiden, the tank was destined to be the queen of battle, around which all other arms would be organized. Their views aroused as much official enthusiasm as the arrival of a horse butcher at a cavalry barracks. In Germany, where defeat had shattered the power of vested interests, Liddell, Hart and Fuller found a hearing. Germany had been forbidden tanks by the Versailles Treaty, but the army had experimented with them in secret. By 1933, they had a few prototypes. When they were demonstrated to Adolf Hitler, he exclaimed with delight, "That's what I need." That's what I want. He lavished money on the German Panzer arm so that by 1939 it could field 10 tank divisions. They were organized to attack, as Fuller and Little Hart had taught, in a compact mass, supported overhead by clouds of tactical aircraft. Their aim was to create irresistible shock on a very narrow front and break in. Once break-in had been achieved, breakthrough was to be completed by finding and exploiting the weak spots inside the enemy positions. It would spread panic and cause psychological as much as material damage. Blitzkrieg, the Germans called the new concept, lightning war. Blitzkrieg struck down Poland first, and then Holland, Belgium, and France. But it was in Russia that Blitzkrieg achieved its most spectacular effects. The world will hold its breath, boasted Hitler at the outset of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. 3 army groups, each tipped by the cutting edge of a panzer corps, broke through the Red Army. 300, 600, 900,000 Russian soldiers and their equipment were swallowed up at a single gulp. Blitzkrieg had changed the face of warfare.
I remember when we took Rostov, for instance, with the tanks, and I was one of the first tanks who drove into Rostov when we took the city away from the Russians. To have conquered a town, to go into the town square, and then there were all the burned out trams were lying around, and you got out of your tank, you were black from all the oil and dust and things flowing around. You had taken a town, you have beaten the enemy, you are the master of it. Okay, a few of them got killed, of your own mates or so. You went over to the other crews and you were laughing again, and then one quickly forgot all the horror things.
In the western desert of North Africa, the Germans also waged a war of movement against the British, though not one they had all their own way. The British were acquiring better tanks and becoming expert in using them. In Europe, the Americans too quickly grasped the secrets of tank warfare. When the Allies descended on Normandy in 1944 to begin the liberation of France, they proved to the Germans that they too had mastered the tactics of breakthrough. Overwhelming air power was part of the secret, widespread use of radio the other.
The magic ingredient for even the tanks themselves to be controlled was the development of being able to use radio sets down to every individual tank on the move.
Pulled back, and they looked as if they...
Here on the plains of Germany, British tank crews in their chieftains developed the difficult art of communicating by radio.
Charlie, Charlie, this is a warning order. Alpha, 3 tanks, grid, 612 783. Mission to destroy. Wait, Charlie, right flanking. The Delta. Call sign 10, 30, and 40. To move around Firebase. Call sign 10, current location. Call sign 20 with this call sign will mask and prevent enemy movement.
The other 10 tanks in your company, them you have to control through radio. It's very difficult. You have to convey to them through some metallic voice all the emotions, all the energy that you want them to carry in the situation where they face the enemy, and you want them to be placed in the right position, because sometimes 2 meters makes a difference.
1112, grid 612 783. Next fire position is just to the left of the barn on the barn.
0, this is Oscar 10. I've now moved out into position.
The problem, of course, as with any military command, is to know what's going on and to be able to see as far as possible. Very seldom possible to see where everybody was. You are the whole time concentrating on what is going on the radio, as well as using your own eyes and your own feel about all the noises going on. And of course, you are on the radio forwards as well as backwards.
Oscar 20, this is their reference for contact. At 11 probe, 612-783, confirm one tank identification over. Oscar 20, at the moment. Oscar 21 is moving round over. Sarah, roger, out.
As the Second World War drew to its climax, the tank began to fall victim to attrition, the very sort of warfare it had been conceived to overcome. Vast production was matched by vast losses. The British and Americans, who produced 30,000 tanks in 1943, found they needed all that came off the factory lines. The Russians manufactured 15,000, but suffered losses at a comparable rate. But this industrial war was one the Germans could not win. Though astoundingly they produced 6,000 tanks in 1943, they could barely make good their losses. Kursk had been a terrible blow for them, the first and greatest of the attrition battles. The British equivalent was Operation Goodwood, where they lost 300 tanks in 2 days. It was their great tank offensive designed to break out of Normandy in 1944, and it failed. In the Battle of Berlin, the Red Army lost 2,000 tanks and assault guns in 3 weeks fighting. The Israelis have sometimes been able to recapture the exhilarating pace of blitzkrieg in their wars against the Arabs. But increasingly they too have found that mass tank battles on narrow fronts kill crews and fill tank graveyards in the same way that the Western Front killed infantry. The tank has also proved to have its limitations. In built-up areas, in close country, in the jungle, as the Americans found in Vietnam, it is all too vulnerable to close-range weapons handled by a hidden enemy.